Hi, everyone. So, since we released episode 8 of Corruption Uncovered 2 weeks ago, a lot has happened in Kansas City, Kansas. So we are bringing you this bonus episode with some updates on what is next for the women who have survived Roger Golubski and some updates on the circumstances surrounding his death. And there was one more conversation we wanted you to hear. I had the chance to sit down with a friend of mine, one of the visionaries and leaders of the Innocence movement, Barry Scheck. He is the person who first brought the stories from KCK to Team Roc, and he has the kind of insight that comes from decades and decades of this work.
It takes an army. This is what we say in the Innocence movement. It doesn't take a village. It takes an army to get an innocent person out of jail who has obvious evidence of innocence.
I'm Josie Duffy Rice, and this is a bonus episode of Corruption Uncovered, a podcast from Roc Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Roc. So first, some updates. We know Roger Golubski died on December 2nd, the day his federal trial was slated to start. But many victims had questions about his death. Had he died by suicide, or was he killed? Was he really dead? When we spoke with attorney Cheryl Pilot in December, she said she understood the skepticism of women who had allegedly been harmed by Golubski.
The lack of trust in the police department is such that there are already many, many theories about what happened. There are some people that don't believe he's dead, that he's been spirited off somewhere. There are people who believe it was a homicide. There are probably a few people that believe it was a suicide, but other people scoff at that. There are people who believe he was encouraged to shoot himself. So there are as many theories as there are people out there.
Now, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation has issued a statement on his death. The KBI says that, quote, the final autopsy report concluded Golubski's cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head, and manner of his death was suicide. The Kansas City Star asked the KBI whether the gun had been tested for fingerprints or DNA evidence, but the Bureau declined to provide any additional information. The KBI also said that Golubski left 5 suicide letters. Those notes were reportedly addressed to his friends and family, which leaves it in their hands to release them, and that seems unlikely. The KBI says it has concluded the investigation into Roger Golubski's death. There's another development as well, a very disappointing one around the civil suit filed by 5 women who say that Roger Golubski harmed them, including 2 we've talked to on the show, Michelle Hawks and Sandra Newsome. The suit was filed against Golubski, yes, but also against 4 other detectives, 3 police chiefs, and the unified government of KCK, which includes the county and the city. The suit alleges that the defendants operated a government-sanctioned protection racket and that they spent decades terrorizing the Black community with the full knowledge of the unified government. It also alleges that defendants covered up murders, forced false testimony, and sexually assaulted and raped plaintiffs, all the things that we've covered this season. The suit catalogs the damages to the women, most of which you can imagine: physical pain, mental anguish, emotional distress. But there were a couple that stood out to me. One was destruction of community. Think about that. The ways in which these repeated crimes by law enforcement not only destroy lives, but whole neighborhoods, by fraying the ties that held them together and breaking the social contract. The other was the allegation that the plaintiffs were stripped of the various pleasures of basic human experience, from the simplest to the most important, including the fundamental freedom to live one's life as an autonomous human being. On January 30th, a judge in Topeka, Kansas, dismissed the lawsuit. The judge didn't rule on the merits of the women's claims. He said that they hadn't filed their claim within the statute of limitations, which was 2 years from when the assault took place. But 2 years after those alleged harms, Roger Golubski was still on the police force. Who would feel safe raising these allegations in court when he was able to operate with impunity for decades? The women say they plan to appeal, but the road ahead for that case doesn't look easy. Barry Scheck knows all about long odds and hard roads. He's a co-founder of the Innocence Project, which has been working to exonerate people for over 30 years now. Barry's one of the lawyers who kind of kicked off the Innocence movement, working to overturn wrongful convictions and pushing for changes in the laws that govern exonerations and police misconduct. Given all the years he's spent thinking about these kind of cases, I asked him how the situation in Kansas City, Kansas compares.
It is extreme. What I was thinking about lately is that, on the one hand, the Lamont McIntyre case itself and exposing Golupski was like the Mississippi burning of civil rights cases, right? I mean, it's just astonishing that this criminal enterprise, and that's what it was, in Kansas City, Kansas, of this police officer, to call him evil and a devil is, and I don't like to use those terms generally, but is kind of an understatement. I mean, almost a white version of the Denzel Washington character in Training Day, but in some ways worse because, he wasn't just about money. In fact, principally probably not about money, but about power and exerting his power to sexually abuse Black women in this community in ways that are almost unimaginable.
I'll break in here to say that it's not unusual for Barry to drop movie references to explain cases. Just in case you're not familiar, Mississippi Burning is about 2 FBI agents trying to investigate murders in a town where the sheriff is in league with the Ku Klux Klan. And Training Day is a classic of the police corruption genre. In that movie, a corrupt, money-hungry detective sets up a younger officer who refuses to play along when he breaks the law. Point being, if your police department is being compared to these 2 movies, you have a problem. The Innocence Project, along with Team Roc and other allies, wanted to understand just how big of a problem there is in KCK. They pressed for the Justice Department to issue a consent decree, essentially saying that yes, there is a pattern or practice of constitutional violations.
In this case, sexually abusing these women, corrupting cases, fixing cases, sex trafficking in Kansas City, Kansas, and you can get civil remedies for that, right? Money. But it's only the Justice Department that can get a consent decree and actually go in and try to clean up the whole place. And the Justice Department has been doing these consent decrees for a few decades now, and it's very hard to get them to do it. And the reason is, one of my friends in the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, who was very sympathetic to doing this, kept saying, I could probably launch one of these in hundreds of police departments all across the United States. So you have to show me why this one is unique. And one of the things that happened after the Obama administration, as they were leaving, is the Civil Rights Division issued a memo that talked about different areas that they wanted to pursue in the next administration. One of the things that they indicated they were interested in doing was looking into the area of sexual abuse by police officers. And it's been a very, very difficult problem to deal with in any police department. But this was plainly the worst one can even imagine, because this was organized. It's not simply that you control the women by sexually abusing them, raping them, and threatening them, as was clear from the Lamont McIntyre case itself. I mean, Lamont was framed for a murder by Golupski because his mother, who was sexually assaulted in the precinct by Golupski, refused to service him in the way that he wanted. And she ran away and she moved and everything else. And eventually he got revenge on her because when these 2 young men were killed by an individual they referred to as Monster, Golupski managed to frame Rose McIntyre's son, Lamont, for the crime. Looked nothing like the guy who really committed it, had alibis, got these eyewitnesses to identify him. The whole thing was fixed. It was a brazen frame. And it's not the only one, obviously, that he did. There was that kind of retaliation. There were quite a number of other women that were in some ways being controlled, not just by the sexual assault, but they were given drugs because they were strung out on that. And there plainly was a financial relationship between Golupski and the drug dealers from particular locations. So this whole thing was open, brazen, and very, very powerful oppression in a poor community. People hear Kansas City and they're thinking Kansas City, Missouri. But Kansas City, Kansas is not Kansas City, Missouri. This is a poor place, primarily of people of color, and the police force just went bad, and it was a complete case of oppression.
I wanted to ask you about this idea that we've kind of heard from the police department. They say, we're sorry, that was a long time ago, and he was a bad guy. They're using the bad apple rhetoric.
Well, there's no way that it's just a bad apple, because he was committing these brazen acts of sexual assault. They all knew that his informants were giving unreliable evidence. His partner, Terry Ziegler, became police chief by the time that we filed the lawsuit. And what was extraordinary is a man named Mark Dupree, who was elected to be the reformed district attorney in Kansas City, Kansas, agreed to form a conviction integrity unit and wanted funding for it. And then Terry Ziegler went to the city council and said, stop it. So how can this just be one bad apple? You know, if Golupski's partner was the police chief, you can't have anything open and notorious like this and then turn around and say, oh, it's just one bad apple. I mean, they were running the place.
What do you make of this culture? Let's say you are a 22-year-old guy and you decide you want to join the police department and you get in and you see this. There's a lot of question of like, why wouldn't you have told anybody? Why didn't anybody report this? And I think people maybe underestimate how the systemic incentives to not be public about what you're seeing.
It's not an excuse. This is life or death. The blue wall of silence is real. I could refer people to movies, one of them based on a true story. What about Frank Serpico? If you have any doubts about it, there's Serpico, who was an undercover, who would not take money. And when his other officers found out about it, he wound up getting shot. And believe me, it's a great movie. This is a very old story. And Johnny Cochran, Peter Neufeld, myself, and Nick Bruston had the privilege of representing Abner Louima in the very famous case where this Haitian man in Brooklyn, was taken into a police station. He was beaten up. He was violated by having a broomstick or a mop stick pushed into his anal cavity. And this blew up New York City. I mean, that is not an understatement. Every place in this city were doing this interview in Brooklyn, right by the bridge. People were coming across the bridge every day, demonstrating, screaming. It was an extraordinary situation. And Abner had showed a lot of courage because he came forward and there was an enormous amount of pressure. And we not only sued the city for what happened by these police officers, but we sued the police union, Police Officers Benevolent Association, because the evidence that Alan Weingrad, who was the leading federal prosecutor there, an incredible guy, great federal prosecutor, they were able to demonstrate that after this happened, everybody got together and made up a cover story. And it's always been a situation where you did not want the good cops to be afraid of the bad ones. So what we did in the Louima case, not only did we hit the union for $2 million for whatever deterrent effect that had, and the city for a very large settlement after the criminal case ended, but we got the city of New York to say they would no longer have what they called the 48-hour rule. And the 48-hour rule said that if the police were involved in an incident that was a shooting or abuse and was being investigated, they didn't have to answer questions for 48 hours until they talked to their union representative, which is like a recipe for people getting their stories together.
Right.
So the city said they would not reinstate that, although unfortunately, to some degree, prosecutors were so used to it, they weren't questioning them anyhow prior to the expiration of 48 hours. But it's a very hard thing. In other words, How could we expect these cops in Kansas City, Kansas, with the brazen abuse of Golubski, not just of the sex workers, but, his connivance with the drug dealers, his use of informants. I mean, there was no trial, and we didn't get to see the government's evidence. But one of the things that disturbed me and the other lawyers the most is that there were many, many dead women all over KCK. And when we looked at the autopsy reports, we found they did not do rape kits. Now, think about that. I mean, if you did a rape kit and you found DNA, you could identify who did it. And how could they not do in so many of these cases rape kits? But there are these women that are found horribly beaten. We had a huge list of dead women that we were examining. That's terror. That's just simply terror. I mean, if you see that happening and they won't investigate the case and everybody's terrified for very good reason, of course the other police officers in the department, they know this can't be going on so openly unless higher-ups or others are allowing it. So it's not just one bad apple. A situation like this, and I hope it's improving, don't get me wrong. Golupski's been indicted. I'm sure people recognize that the federal agents are still looking at them, I hope. And it's become so public through the work of all these lawsuits, some great journalists. And let's not forget, because I never will, Roc Nation.
I was going to ask you if you could tell me why you wanted to get them involved.
Well, Roc Nation began a series of conversations during COVID among a whole group of people. And it's kind of crazy when you think about the different people involved. I mean, here we are in a pandemic. We had these conversations periodically, and it's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, we had a very interesting and diverse group that would just talk about what can we do, what should be done. And eventually this led to Roc Nation forming what they called the United Justice Coalition. And that's when I met Desiree Perez.
Desiree Perez, Roc Nation CEO.
And so I'm very grateful that Desiree and the others at Roc Nation thought that some projects that I was working on with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and different innocence organizations on police misconduct information. Because certainly after George Floyd's murder, there were statutes that were passed that made it public record, particularly in places that had strong police unions like New York and California, Baltimore, Maryland, were able to get access to information about past acts of misconduct that the police departments themselves made findings about their own officers that had previously been secret. It was like the black hole of the criminal legal system. I have bar cards in New York and California, and I was shocked that those were the two worst states. I had no idea that all these cases I've been trying since 1975, when I started as a public defender in the Bronx, that there could have been all these police officers who had very serious acts of prior misconduct that we never knew about.
Tracking police misconduct is really, really hard. That's something Team Roc has been working on in KCK, trying to get records from the KCKPD through the state's open records law, the Kansas Open Records Act, or KORA. The department has only released a few pieces of information, but so little that Team Roc and the Midwest Innocence Project filed a KORA lawsuit in late 2024 to push for full transparency. They've asked for information on complaints filed against members of the KCKPD about things like stealing or selling drugs, harassing people, sexual assault, tampering with evidence, and other misconduct. They've asked for records on complaints about or investigations of Roger Golubski, but they haven't been given any of those records. They haven't even been given the most basic thing they asked for, just a list of people who have worked for the KCKPD since 1970. That kind of opposition is part of what makes the project that Barry's talking about, the Full Disclosure Project, such a landmark effort. Criminal defense lawyers, advocacy groups, and data scientists teamed up and used artificial intelligence to gather and analyze data on policing. That project covered 5 states and 2 cities, and advocates and allies in California are also working on a statewide disclosure database there.
California passed a statute that said that every police officer and every correction officer has to get, number one, a license. Number two, they have to have a, quote, unique identifier, because badge numbers are reusable, right? So if you're trying to collect data on police officers who've committed acts of misconduct and track them, sometimes they call it the wandering officer problem, right? Within a state or across states, you can't do it without a unique identifier. So this effort that's going on in California, it's the first time we've done it. We'll have a public-facing database. It's a big deal. And I give Roc Nation an enormous amount of credit for helping us get started. So we'll see how that goes.
I think people have this idea, right, that let's say you were wrongfully convicted. Let's say you're Lamont McIntyre. You get a lawyer easily, you go to court, you get exonerated. That it's very straightforward, right?
I mean, it's unbelievable what it takes. It takes an army. This is what we say in the Innocence movement. It doesn't take a village. It takes an army to get an innocent person out of jail who has obvious evidence of innocence. Particularly, in this case, there was no DNA testing that was done. It was just blatant false testimony put forward that eventually, when people had the courage to come forward, witnesses recanting, right? Those witnesses who, said this identification was fixed, they coerced me into doing it. That's scary. That was very scary. And they're living with this fear to this day.
And so Lamont McIntyre obviously got exonerated and settled with the city, even though the unified government did not admit any wrongdoing.
Let's talk about his case for a second, though, because it was a landmark case in so many ways. First, just think of his mother coming forward and the courage it took to tell that story about what Golupski did to her, right? And then uncovering all of this. But this was a landmark case because everybody could see that Lamont was innocent. So in the state of Kansas, they passed the Lamont McIntyre bill, which actually established state compensation for wrongful convictions, which they didn't have. So that was a very big deal.
There are other men that we talked to, their mothers, their loved ones, their sisters, et cetera, who Golupski allegedly also framed. And, one of the things that someone wrote me and said was, now that they know that he did this, why can't they just get out? And I think you are the perfect person to explain just doesn't work like that.
It doesn't work like that. On the other hand, I think that more could be done through that conviction integrity unit in Kansas City, Kansas. More resources put into it. Look, Mark Dupree formed it. The first thing that happened is Golupski's partner, who is chief of police, Terry Ziegler, says, well, we don't want that. The unified government shouldn't be funding that. So there's been a lot of resistance to it. It's been very hard to get that started in a robust way. It's a little difficult when innocence lawyers are talking to the district attorney and the district attorney is saying, I don't really feel comfortable discussing this in my office. Let's go somewhere else. But much more. There are so many more innocent people that were framed over the years in this situation that, I know the Midwest Innocence Project and others are working on, and there should be more exonerations than we've seen so far. And hopefully they'll happen a little bit more rapidly.
So on one hand, like you said earlier, and like we've discussed, it's amazing that, Lamont McIntyre was exonerated. It's amazing that Golupski was indicted twice, even though he never went to actual trial. It's even amazing that this story is even being told, nationally. And on the other hand, like you just said, right, it takes an army. He never gets convicted. The civil case got dismissed. And you could feel like, what's the point? What gives you hope? What makes you kind of keep doing this? Because, it doesn't mean you get everything, right?
Far from it. This is a civil rights movement. Frankly, around the world, exonerating innocent people is an international civil rights movement. And it's kind of crazy that it's a comparatively recent phenomenon to be able to discover all these wrongfully convicted people. because anybody that looked at the criminal legal system in the United States, with the lack of resources that defense lawyers had, with the effects of racism and all the factors involved in wrongful convictions that so many of us have written about for so long, we know there's a lot of cases of wrongful convictions, over the last 2 centuries that we've missed in the United States. And so, it's almost hard to utter the phrase, the system is improving. But let's just put it this way. We are engaged in the struggle to improve this system with much greater understanding of how it functions each decade. We learn more each decade. But these artificial intelligence tools are going to teach us a lot if we have the willingness to employ them in a way that is aligned with social and democratic values. And I didn't just pull that phrase out of the air. That's the mantra of a very great scientist and thinker, Alondra Nelson, who created the Code of Ethics for Artificial Intelligence, essentially for the Biden administration, and is now at Princeton, and I should add, is on the board of the Innocence Project. So I am very pessimistic about recent events, but I'm still optimistic and hopeful that, there can be resistance to this and we can move forward in a very significant way. I always feel that way. You have to. I grew up in the civil rights and anti-war movements, right? And, it's never easy.
I think part of Barry's hope, his optimism, is rooted in the approach that much of the innocence movement has taken. It's not really about overthrowing a system or even drastically reimagining one. It's about trying to make the courts do what they're supposed to do, to live up to their self-proclaimed ideals, to bring just outcomes.
It's hard to imagine that people would say, we don't want to exonerate the wrong man or woman who has been convicted of a crime, particularly when the person who really committed the crime may be at large committing more, right? It's not good for public safety and certainly for justice to have that situation. So I've always been amazed that people could be against innocence work, and in truth, they probably haven't been. You have these conviction integrity units. You have people recognizing that there are so many more innocent people convicted than they ever thought. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. There are thousands, understatement, of innocent people in prison now in the United States. There have been innocent people executed. We know that. There may well be innocent people executed soon. I am terrified for our client, Robert Roberson, who plainly was convicted when his child died of the flu, not of shaken baby syndrome. So there's so much important work to be done. But having said that, I have no patience for people that give up.
In the last episode, we talked about all the things that could happen at the state and local level to create change in Kansas City, Kansas. And we talked about the ways you can get involved wherever you live. If you haven't heard that one, I suggest you go back and listen. I also wanted to point you to another way to get involved, which is to come to the United Justice Coalition Summit. The UJC is the group that Barry mentioned, the group convened by Roc Nation to shine a light on key justice issues and the need for criminal justice reform. It's a powerful day of panels, conversations, and opportunities to take action, and it brings together people from all walks of life, seasoned professionals across industries and sectors, community advocates, elected officials, directly impacted people, and students. It's inspiring and hopeful, and there's also an organization exhibition area showcasing local and national nonprofits working on justice reform. Best of all, it's completely free and open to the public, so stay tuned for the official date and location, and visit UnitedJusticeCoalition.com or follow United Justice Coalition on social media for updates. I know some of our team from this show will be attending. Maybe I'll see you there. We'll put the link in the show notes. Thanks again for listening. Corruption Uncovered is a podcast from Roc Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Roc. Team Roc partners with the Midwest Innocence Project to uncover corruption in Kansas City, Kansas. We want to extend a special thanks to the KCK community of survivors and advocates. And you can follow the fight at corruptionuncoveredpodcast.com and at Team Roc, ROC, on socials. Corruption Uncovered is produced by Pineapple Street Studios. I'm your host, Josie Duffy Rice. This episode was written and produced by me and Kat Aaron, with additional production support from Justine Dom, Eric Mennel, and Yinka Rickford Ingwin. Our editor is Joel Lovell, fact-checking by Will Tavlin, music licensing by Epidemic Sound. Our recording engineers are Pedro Alvira and Marina Pais, mixing by Marina Pais. Kat Aaron and J.Ann Barry are executive producers. And thank you for listening.